Okay. Okay, good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Peggy Kurtz. This is a meeting of Lower Hudson Group of Sierra Club. It is co-sponsored with quite a number of groups, the Mid-Hudson Group of Sierra Club, Indian Point Safe Energy Coalition, Religious Orders Along the River, Stop the Algonquin Pipeline Expansion, Stop Holtec, Third Act Upstate New York, United for Clean Energy, and Westpac. Quite a list, but we're glad because we think it's a very important topic. Before we dive in, I just want to mention that next month we'll be meeting on the fourth Monday. It'll be October 27th, and the topic will be zero waste. We'll also be talking about the incinerator in large Wheelabrator incinerator in Westchester. And the following month, we'll be talking about, on November 20th, we'll be talking about the fungal networks beneath our feet that are really vital to life on this planet, to plant life, which obviously supports everything else. So the topic that we're talking about today kind of came up in my mind during the pandemic. At some point during the pandemic, I began to think to myself, could there be some, why all of a sudden are we seeing this pandemic? It's just so completely unprecedented. How could, what would be causing this? Could there possibly be some connection with climate change or some other environmental factor? And I went online, and sure enough, I began to find lots of articles documenting a connection. And this particular talk, I should mention, is part of a series that we're doing on the loss of biodiversity, which is a real crisis, a very serious crisis, and the crisis of extinctions, which are really one and the same. So this is one in a series. We've spoken about, I don't want to take up the time to list all the topics, but we are, George, you're admitting people. So, okay, so this is one in a series. I just wanted to mention, this is a crisis that not as many people as should be are aware of, and it's really a critical crisis, as perhaps Dr. Vora can discuss a little bit. So Dr. Vora is, I could take another 5 minutes to give you his bio. He's a physician, which I won't do, public health leader and conservationist. He's the executive director of Preventing Pandemics at the Source Coalition and senior advisor for One Health at Conservation International. He worked nearly 10 years as a CDC epidemiologist, where he led high-stakes outbreak investigations around the world, from anthrax to Zika. In 2020, he led the New York City COVID-19 contact tracing. He currently co-chairs the Lancet Commission on Preventing Viral Spillover, and he's an adjunct professor at Columbia and continues to care for patients in a public tuberculosis clinic in New York City. And I hope I got that right. Thank you very much, Dr. Vora, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Peggy. It is such an honor to be here. I really appreciate everyone's time on this Monday evening. I'm close by to many of you because I'm based near New Paltz in the Hudson Valley area. So it's great to see this. And again, really appreciate this opportunity to share share some of the science on spillovers, why they're happening, how to prevent them, and how we can approach pandemics more holistically as a planet. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you all can see the slides. So the title of this talk is "An Investment in Nature is an Investment in Health." And as Peggy said, I'm a medical doctor, so I come at this from a human health perspective, but we're all interconnected, and that's one of the major points of this talk. Just some disclaimers. The views in this presentation are mine, not necessarily that of my employer, and I have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose. All right. So a few objectives here. Number one is to describe how human health is inextricably linked to the health of other animals and the environment. Number two is to describe how human activities are driving infectious disease emergence. And number three is to describe how the destruction of nature leads to health inequity. Right. So I'm going to do this in the course of maybe like the next 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a lot of time for Q&A as well. So a few definitions so that we're all on the same page to begin with. I'm going to use the term pathogen to describe an organism that causes disease. A zoonosis is a disease in humans caused by a pathogen with a non-human animal source. Emerging infectious diseases are infectious diseases whose incidence in humans has increased or threatens to increase in the near future. And then pathogen spillover is the transmission of pathogens across species. All right. So to start off, I'm going to rewind back almost 20 years ago. I was in medical school. I took a year off in med school to spend most of that year in the country of Uganda, where I was doing HIV and malaria research in this rural part of Uganda. And as an undergraduate, I had done a lot of marine biology research. And one day, out of the blue, my research mentor from my undergraduate days emailed me this paper that had just been published in the journal Nature, one of the top scientific journals in the world. It was published in 2008, so she emailed it to me. And this, for me, was a light bulb moment. It's hard to, or it's unusual to say that a scientific paper could change the course of someone's life, but this paper did that for me. Because ever since I've been young, I've wanted to pursue a career that combines public health and environmental conservation. I, like many of you on this call, have always loved nature and animals. And at the same time, I grew up keenly aware of the field of public health because my dad, who's originally from India, had smallpox as a child. Maybe many of you on this call actually have been vaccinated for smallpox before. But when he was less than 5, he had the disease smallpox, which kills over 30% of people that it infects. And he thankfully survived, which is why I'm here to this day. But he was the one who told me about the amazing public health workers around the world, particularly in the 60s and 70s, that led a smallpox eradication campaign that was ultimately successful. And that is a gift that keeps on giving. That is a disease that none of us really have to worry about today. We don't even give that vaccine routinely anymore because we have eradicated the disease. And so when I got into med school, I wanted to combine environmental conservation with public health because I knew deep down that our health is linked to the health of other animals on the planet. I didn't know exactly how, but when I would talk to my medical school faculty through no fault of their own, they really couldn't point me in the direction of how to build a career at the intersection of conservation and health. But then this paper was what changed all of that for me. And the main figure in this paper is shown in this graph right here. You see the x-axis horizontally is the decade. The y-axis shows the number of emerging infectious disease events. And basically, this paper showed that even when you control for a surveillance bias, that decade after decade, the number of emerging infectious disease events is increasing, and that most of these events are triggered by zoonotic diseases, by pathogens that jump from animals to humans, right? And that, for me, was the light bulb moment. Now, if you think about COVID, right, there have actually, if you rewind back to 2020, many people were saying that COVID was a once in a century event. That is not true. Since 1918, there had been 5 other pandemics. So basically, there is a pandemic on average every 15 to 20 years over the last century. And in total, these pandemics have killed over 90 million people. 5 of these 6 pandemics, 4 of them were flu, 1 of them was HIV. 5 of these 6 were certainly the result of spillovers of viruses from animals to people. The 6th one, COVID, the most recent one, well, we do not definitively know the cause of the COVID pandemic, but most experts in the field, including myself, believe that it originated from a spillover event as well, because there is a large volume of peer-reviewed evidence that shows that it very likely started in the wildlife market, or a wet market as it's sometimes called, and that the initial cases occurred in those areas. And there's a lot of swab evidence where they were doing environmental sampling that showed that this virus was in the same areas where animals known to be capable of becoming infected by the virus that causes COVID were also residing, right? So there's a number of reasons why many of us believe that COVID also was a result of a spillover. But the point here is, even when you take COVID aside, 5 of these 6 pandemics were caused by spillover events, causing over 90 million deaths. And based on current trajectory, we can actually expect the frequency of pandemics to increase in the coming decades because of these ongoing pressures that we are putting on the planet, which we're going to go into right now. Now, there's a number of different reasons why spillovers are increasing around the world, right? And I'm not talking about once a pathogen is in people. Once it has already spilled over in people, we know that the reasons why we are seeing an increased ability for these pathogens to spread is related to crowding and population density, and also global travel, where we can get on a plane and be on the other side of the planet within a few hours. But I'm talking about before the pathogen gets into people. Why are these spillovers actually on the rise? And there's 4 reasons among others, but there's 4 major ones. Number 1 is related to deforestation and forest degradation. Number 2 is related to the commercial wildlife trade pipeline. Number 3 is related to poor biosecurity, or by which I mean poor infection control when raising farmed animals. And reason number 4 is climate change. Okay, so let's do a deep dive into the first of these reasons, just to explain how deforestation drives infectious disease emergence and spillovers. Well, there's at least 4 reasons for this. Reason number 1, as you can see in this picture right here, is that when deforestation happens, it creates this forest edge that creates opportunities for humans and domestic animals to interact with wildlife. Wildlife being the reservoirs for a number of different viruses that can then jump into people. Reason number 2 is that deforestation stresses wildlife. They are losing their home. And in the same way, when we are stressed, maybe we've not had enough sleep, or we're having a lot of work stress, or whatever is happening, that we humans are more likely to get sick. The same goes for wildlife. When they are losing their homes, they are more likely to become infected and then shed viruses that can go on to infect people. Reason number 3, this gets back to what Peggy was talking about loss of biodiversity. When we deforest, we are losing biodiversity, but science shows that the species that are left behind tend to be generalist species that can survive near humans, whereas the ones that disappear first are specialist species that can only live in the forest. But for whatever the reason, these animals that are generalists are more likely to host pathogens that can then go on to infect people. And then reason number 4 is that deforestation drives climate change, and climate change is an independent driver of infectious disease emergence. In fact, over 50% of known infectious diseases have been aggravated by climate change in one way or another. So one of the major take-home messages from this presentation is that human activities are driving the accelerating pace of pathogen spillover that we are seeing around the world. In other words, we are creating the very conditions that are unleashing these contagions upon ourselves. Now, very little good came out of COVID. We had millions of people die, but at the very least, we are now finally talking more seriously at the highest levels of government about the need to reduce morbidity and mortality from pandemics. Because it's not a question of if another pandemic is going to occur, rather it's a question of when the next pandemic will be occurring. So let's dive a little bit deeper. How do we accomplish a reduction in our vulnerability and the threat of pandemics? Well, that requires investment in 2 buckets of activities. Bucket number 1 is pandemic prevention, which is about avoiding a pandemic in the first place, reducing the threat. And bucket number 2 is around increasing pandemic preparedness, which is our ability to respond if a pandemic occurs. If we underinvest in either of these domains, it will result in the failure to lower the risk of another pandemic occurring, or result in mismanagement of the next pandemic when it occurs. Now, the unfortunate news, even though we are talking more about pandemics and pandemic governance in policy circles and in scientific circles, unfortunately, in many of these discussions on the future of pandemic investments, prevention is often neglected in favor of preparedness. Let me give you some examples. Here is a screenshot of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, which was stood up by the World Health Organization, the WHO, back in 2020. You'll notice that prevention is not even mentioned in the name of this panel. And the report, the first report, the main report of this panel was released in May of 2021. It was titled COVID-19, Make It the Last Pandemic. Yet this 86-page document only had one mention of the word deforestation and two mentions of the word wildlife in the entire report. And it begs the question, how can we make COVID the last pandemic if establishment global health voices are not even talking about the drivers of pathogen spillover? Now, why does the public health sector tend to neglect pandemic prevention? Well, there are a few reasons for this. First of all, there tends to be a preference for specialists over generalists. We see this in clinical medicine as well, right? In the United States, we tend to invest more resources in specialty care of patients rather than in generalist care of patients. Even though if we want to improve health overall in the United States, we need to be investing more in generalist doctors, like family doctors and internal medicine doctors and pediatricians. Well, the same thing on the public health level. We tend to focus on our science on people who can go deep and narrow into particular topics, like how a particular protein works, rather than people who can lift their eyes and see the big picture. And it's not that one is more important than the other. Rather, we need to be investing across the board. Reason number two is that there's an aversion to complexity. It's much simpler if you're just talking about humans. But when you start throwing in the rainforest and animals and bats and raccoon dogs and on and on and on, you get more and more complex, the system, and it just becomes more difficult for our human mind to grasp. Reason number three is that there's this short-termism. We tend to focus on short timelines rather than the long perspective, right? So we tend to focus on 2 to 4 to 5 year cycles rather than benefits over a decade or 2 decades down the road. Reason number four is that it's difficult to measure the success of pandemic prevention because it's about avoiding a pandemic in the first place. You do not have a counterfactual to compare to, as opposed to when you say that, oh, we're going to be putting vaccines in the arms of kids. You can count how many children got the vaccine. And finally, there's a bias for inaction. We just tend to wait for bad things to happen rather than getting ahead of it and preventing the occurrence of the bad event in the first place. Now, the good news is that I've seen a change over time. If you look at more recent documents from the World Health Organization independent panel that I mentioned a moment ago, or even in the Biden administration over the course of 2021 through early 2025, we saw a shift in the Biden administration's stance. And earlier this year, just in May of this year, the World Health Organization adopted a landmark agreement on pandemics that included a dedicated article on pandemic prevention. And I'm saying all this to say that, to make the point that advocacy from civil society, like nonprofit organizations and universities, led to that shift over the last 5 years, right? This type of advocacy and raising awareness matters. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into pandemic prevention. What do I mean when I say pandemic prevention? Well, there's actually 2 different buckets of pandemic prevention. We'll start with the second bucket, which is more focused on the human side of the equation first. And that refers to secondary prevention. That is about containing the spread of a pathogen after an outbreak has already occurred in people to avoid an epidemic or a pandemic from occurring, right? So if you have an outbreak, let's say of Ebola, you want to quickly contain that outbreak so it does not keep spreading across a region like we saw back in 2013 and 2014 across West Africa, right? So that's that secondary prevention. Or maybe there's some new coronavirus that emerges. We want to be able to quickly detect it with good surveillance so that we can then implement contact tracing and vaccination and isolation of cases so that we can break chains of transmission, right? So that's secondary prevention. Now, even though we don't talk a lot about prevention in the public health sector, when decision makers are if they ever talk about prevention, they tend to be talking about secondary prevention, and that's because secondary prevention and pandemic preparedness are related, right? When you invest in pandemic preparedness, you also increase the ability to do secondary prevention. What they talk less about is primary prevention. And that is about avoiding outbreaks in people altogether by reducing the risk of spillovers, by improving laboratory safety, and by addressing biological weapons, right? It's not that any one of these are we should only be doing one or not the others. We actually need to be investing across the board, especially with the rise of artificial intelligence, especially as we improve our ability to do synthetic biology. Improving lab safety and addressing biological weapons becomes more and more important. But one point I want to make is that based on historical precedent and the ongoing pace of environmental degradation, spillover is the most likely cause of the next pandemic, meaning that reducing risk of spillovers must be a priority for public health. Now, why are secondary prevention and preparedness efforts alone insufficient? Well, there's 4 reasons at least. Number one is that there's an inequity in the distribution of the tools of secondary prevention and pandemic preparedness. We saw this with COVID-19. We saw it with Mpox vaccines, where the people in greatest need often have least amount of access to the tools of prevention, secondary prevention and preparedness. Reason number 2 is that emerging infectious diseases often defy conventional wisdom. Just look at in the last 12, 15 years with Ebola, Zika, SARS-CoV-2, monkeypox virus, when we are in the midst of an epidemic and a pandemic, we learn so many surprising features of these viruses. It's better not to wait to that extent. When you have a lot of spread in people, it's better to just avoid the outbreak in the first place. Reason number 3 is because of spillback. Once you have a zoonotic pathogen in people, we can actually pass that pathogen back into animals. And as the virus crosses that species border, it can pick up mutations as it does so. And if it were to come back into people after that, it could actually become even more virulent. And finally, we live in an age of disinformation and rising populism in which even if you have a fantastic vaccine or a fantastic medicine, there is no guarantee that large segments of the population will choose to take that vaccine to achieve target levels of vaccination. So we want to be preventing before we get to the point of needing to vaccinate people, for example. Now, how do you actually reduce risk of spillover? Well, number 1 is by stopping deforestation and forest degradation in heavily forested tropical areas. Number 2 is that we have to enhance the health and economic security of communities living in areas of high deforestation. Number 3 is that we have to strictly regulate wildlife trade and wildlife markets involving species that pose a public health risk. And reason number 4, or action number 4, is that we have to improve infection control when raising farmed animals. I want to be very clear about one thing. I'm not saying that one intervention is better than the rest. So it should not be putting all of our eggs in the spillover prevention basket or all of our eggs in the pandemic preparedness basket, just focusing on people. Rather, we need to be thinking across the board. We need to be thinking holistically. And this means that we need to be using the Swiss cheese model because no intervention is perfect. So by using a layered approach where we put in one barrier after another barrier after another barrier, we reduce the risk of a bad event from happening. We reduce the chances that all those holes will line up and the bad event will happen. There's also a very strong economic argument behind investing in pandemic prevention. If you look at COVID, that pandemic cost millions of lives and trillions of dollars. But if you compare that to preventing spillover, well, we could do that effectively for $20 to $30 billion a year. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually a drop in the bucket, again, compared to the cost of a pandemic. And my colleagues published the research behind this in the journal Science just a few years ago. Now, for a moment, I want to do a segue into bats. Some of you might have heard, I mean, all of us live in the Hudson Valley, I think, for the most part. So we're dealing with bats. Some of you might have gotten the rabies vaccine before. You might have had bats in your home. I love bats. They are my second favorite group of animals after snakes. I want to be very clear that I am not trying to vilify bats here. They provide so many important ecological services, such as controlling insect populations. Some of you might have heard about a recent study that showed that white nose syndrome that has been killing over 1 million bats across North America has actually led to an increase in the use of pesticides by farmers as bats have disappeared. And so they're eating fewer insects. So farmers are using more pesticides. And the scientists behind this work also showed that, not conclusively, but showed that this increase in use of pesticides might also be driving increased infant mortality, right? So let me be very clear, bats are very important for a lot of different reasons, but they're also known reservoirs for viruses like Marburg virus, which is a cousin of Ebola, or Nipah virus, Hendra virus, which are really deadly viruses, or rabies virus. And there's a number of different reasons why bats have this ability to harbor viruses. Is because of their special immune systems and their ability to fly long distances, just like people when we get on planes and we can carry our pathogens all over. Now, I'm about to tell you about an investigation that I led for the CDC back in 2013. We had heard of this. Well, actually, as I proceed with this conversation, I also want to be very clear. I'm not trying to sensationalize any particular cultural activity. There are things that we do here in the United States that might seem odd to people in other parts of the world. In the same way, there are things that people do in other parts of the world that might seem foreign to us. But the point here is not to make fun of anyone's activities or to stop people from doing certain things. Rather, the point here is to keep people safe and to make sure that people have access to the tools to stay healthy. Now, we had heard about this annual festival that takes place in this one part of rural Nigeria. Actually, it happens twice a year, where there are these two caves, and people are only allowed inside of these caves during the 2 times of the year. And actually, it's only men and boys who are allowed inside of these caves. And it's the local king and his priests say, now is the time of the year for this festival. And basically, people run into the caves. Men and boys are running into the caves. They're swinging tree branches. They're knocking down bats. They're catching bats with their bare hands. But our concern was that these caves are home to Rosetus aegypticus bats. And so this type of bat is a known reservoir for Marburg virus in Central Africa. Like I said before, the Marburg virus is a cousin of Ebola virus. And so our concern was that in the course of this festival, people might be getting exposed to viruses such as Marburg virus, and therefore this could be sparking a potential outbreak. And so here you see one of the bat hunters holding a Rosetus aegypticus bat that he caught in the course of this festival. You see bat hunters, you can see the slingshots around their neck, and again, they're holding these bats. And then here's a pile of Rosetus aegypticus bats. And then these bats are cooked and eaten. And so, I want to be very clear, right? Unless you are handling the bat safely, do not go and touch a bat. If you're worried about a bat in your home, call your local health department or animal control services to help you manage the situation. But, we went into this part of Nigeria to conduct an investigation to better understand what type of risk are people at, what type of viruses are in these bats. And of course, all of this work is done with the with government health partners, so from the Nigerian Ministry of Health and from local health department, as well as local university researchers, right? So this type of work is always done hand in hand. And of course, you want to get community buy-in for this type of work. And so we went to the king's palace. You can see here we are in the palace. The king is at the center in the red garments to get his permission to enter the caves. All this work was when we traveled around, we were moving around in bulletproof vehicles with armed guards with AK-47s, because this is an area of Nigeria with some instability. But we got permission, thankfully, from the king to enter the caves and to do surveys. And so here you can see us trekking through the rainforest to get to the caves. And the cave is in the back. You can see those massive boulders, and my colleague Mike is in the foreground. So when we go inside the caves, we're fully suited up in that hazmat suit, and you climb the boulders and then you descend down. And once you're inside the caves, it's pitch black. The floor is literally moving. There are amphibians and insects all over the floor. Up above you, there are bats flying. I love this type of stuff. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. We, of course, also did surveys with the surrounding communities to understand how people are engaging in this festival, what type of precautions are they taking. And in the course of this research, we discovered a new species of bat-borne bacteria that we found was infecting people. And we also found evidence of Lissa virus circulation in these bats. Lissa viruses include rabies virus and other deadly viruses. And in our surveys, over 2,000 people were represented. 10% of those people reported having had bat contact. 2% had ever been bitten by a bat. These are really high rates of exposures to bats, right? My guess is that on this call, a lot of you might have had a bat in your home, but not many of you know that you've been bitten by a bat or scratched by a bat. And of those with bat contact, only 1% had ever received rabies vaccination. And so the point here is that this is an area at high risk of an outbreak, but there's a massive inequity in access to the necessary health precautions. But I also want to be clear again, this is not, the point here is not to say, oh, they are doing this bad activity over there. Here in the United States, we also harvest wildlife. When I was again at the CDC, I did an investigation of a young former soldier in the US military who had been catching raccoons in his backyard to train his dogs to hunt. And he got bitten by a raccoon in the course of that, never got the vaccine, and then ended up dying of rabies. And then his people didn't know that he had died of rabies. His organs were taken and transplanted into other people. And one of those other people ended up getting rabies themselves, right? So my point here is that there are practices that are done in the United States and other parts of the world that put us at risk of getting spillovers of viruses. And the point here is that we need to take actions to prevent those spillovers. Now I'm going to start zooming out and talking more about a number of other concerns. But we are, as a human species, we are experiencing a syndemic with common etiologies. Pandemics, climate change, and biodiversity loss are all symptoms of a planet in despair. Now, the climate is changing because of human activities, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, which leads to millions upon millions of premature deaths every year. The evidence behind human-driven climate change is unequivocal, and the effects are already being experienced. We here in our part of New York experience the fallout of wildfires hundreds of miles away in Canada in the form of worsening air quality, right? And there are many other events that also we're going to continue to experience in the coming decades. And the health impacts of climate change are so far reaching. It certainly exacerbates asthma. It can cause more infectious disease transmission. It can make allergies worse. It can cause malnutrition. It can cause civil conflict and forced migration. There's mental health impacts. There's heat-related illness impacts. And then there's injuries and fatalities from extreme weather events. The point is that the climate crisis is a health crisis. And there's also an equity issue here because the countries that emit the least amount of emissions are at highest risk of adverse events from a changing climate. And climate change disproportionately impacts women, children, socioeconomically marginalized people not yet born today. A health threat anywhere is a health threat everywhere. But let's also talk about biodiversity, which Peggy brought up. Biodiversity refers to the variety of all life on this planet, from the genetic makeup of plants and animals to human cultural diversity, and it is the underpinning of all life on Earth. Now, up until now, there have been 5 mass extinctions. 4 of these were caused by climate change, produced by greenhouse gases from a variety of different mechanisms. One of these was from an asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, approximately. But we are now in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. When humanity evolved, when Homo sapiens evolved, there had never been as much species richness as there was up until that point of time. But now, because of our activities, particularly habitat destruction and climate change, up to 500,000 species are at risk of extinction. So we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, and this is irreversible. Once they are gone forever. We are losing species that we do not even know about. So even with all this talk about reviving species, we are losing species before we know that they even existed. So how are we going to bring them back? But biodiversity creates a web of life, and we are slowly unraveling that web of life. At this point in time, if you look at all the mass of all mammals on this planet, 96% of all mammalian biomass are people and our livestock. Only 4% are now wildlife. This is not sustainable. We cannot cause this amount of imbalance and have a future for humanity. There is no future for humanity without nature. And we as a species depend on biodiversity for our mental health and for new medicines and for our food and for good air and for good water and for protection from infectious diseases. We need biodiversity to survive. Now, some people have called this new epoch that we are in the Anthropocene, where humans are the dominant force shaping the the planet's biophysical conditions. I want to be clear, the people who make the official decisions on what is an epoch and what is not an epoch don't agree with this, but colloquially, we do say that we are now in the Anthropocene, where our impacts on Earth's natural systems are intensifying exponentially. Now, I want to be very clear. Our activities to extract resources from around the world, including fossil fuels, have led to great improvements in access to energy and per capita food production and reduced poverty and better health. But now we are at this inflection point where the state of our health and that of the planet's natural systems are beginning to trend in opposite directions. One person has said before, we have been mortgaging the health of future generations to realize economic and development gains in the present. So is the global environment in a bad place? Yes. But I also want to be clear, we have not lost yet. We must reject the delusion that it is too late to act. What happens from here is our choice. It is very easy to get overwhelmed with all of this bad news, but I also want to commend all of you for being here on a Monday night at 7 p.m. talking about these types of things. Action is the best antidote to despair. And as one of my favorite activists have said before, we don't need 100 perfect activists. We need 1 million imperfect ones. None of us are perfect, but choose your area to make your impact in and go deep and do well. Do it well and spread the word. Inspire other people to take action. And one of my favorite writers, Jamie Reeser, has all this fantastic writing, but I wanted to read this one passage from one of her essays in particular. That means a lot to me. The planet is destined to pass away. It is subject to the same processes of decay and destruction as anything else that has taken shape in the universe. I have made the conscious decision to stop trying to save the world. I want to honor my relationship to Mother Earth despite her mortality. I began to explore what I wanted it to mean to me to be human. My life has become an expression of my love for her. I have come home to her by accepting myself and Homo sapien as animal, as natural, as an aspect of her, and, as hard as it may be at times, to try to love every part of her. The love I am referring to is not an ungrounded New Age notion. To the contrary, the love that I speak of requires humans to stand firmly and consciously in the messy thick of it. I've decided to stop trying to save the world. Instead, I've decided to actively love this world while being fully aware of its temporal limitations, its mortality. Loving this world has not guaranteed my life, but it has given me inspiration to live. So with that, a reminder, nature is medicine, conservation is public health. And with that, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. I'm definitely going to be watching this video again because this was very, very informative. So you should be able to raise your hand by clicking on the react button at the bottom and then looking for raise your hand. You can also go like this with your hand if you want, or put questions into the chat. I have a few questions, but I just wanted to leave it open for others. George, can you figure out how to unmute everyone? So we can, maybe people can, so,
I've made it so that people can unmute themselves.
okay, perfect, okay. So, let me see. What about Ebola? I noticed that you sort of took that out of my list. Was there a reason why you took it out? Is that the same or different?
Ebola, so I have had the great privilege of responding to the two biggest Ebola outbreaks ever. I was in West and Central Africa, and they were awful situations. The amount of despair, how scary those situations were for the people living there, but also, in the United States, we were, an ocean away, and there was a lot of concern back in 2013, if you remember, about importation of Ebola cases here. We have known about the Ebola virus for over almost 50 years at this point, 49 years. We still have not definitively identified the source of Ebola virus. We think that it's in bats, But part of the reason why I'm saying like we've known about it for almost 5 decades is to underscore how challenging it is to find the source of an infectious disease. We have only had COVID for now 5 years, and there's this expectation that the source should have been identified immediately, but it's really difficult to find the source. But again, based on the preponderance of information we have available, it's very likely that the source of Ebola are bats, and the source of COVID is because of spillover in a wildlife market. But there are other viruses like Marburg virus, Nipah, Hendra, Mpox, where we more definitively know that the source are certain animals.
And can you just talk briefly? I realize it's a whole, I'm sure there's a lot that's been published on this, but why is it that you feel that COVID came from one of these marketplaces rather than from a lab?
Yeah, so there happens to be a major institute of virology in the city of Wuhan, which is a city of like over 10 million people, millions upon millions of people live there. So when you look at the available evidence, there certainly was work being done on coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but there is no clear virus that was the direct precursor virus that we know of from that Institute of Virology. So there's a lot of conjecture that other more distantly related viruses were modified and that led to the COVID pandemic. But again, there's no definitive evidence that that precursor was in the Institute of Virology. All we know is that there are much more distantly related viruses. But when you look at the flip side about the amount of evidence about the origins from a wildlife market, it's a lot more convincing. For example, the first human cases of COVID can be traced back to that market, which is very far away from the Institute of Virology. So if the first people that got infected were in the Institute of Virology, why would they have actually, those first cases have popped up in the wildlife market, which is far away from the Virology Institute, rather than the first cases being around the Virology Institute itself? That's one reason. Number two is that a lot of environmental swabs were done of the wildlife market. Now, the Chinese authorities basically euthanized all the animals after the emergence of the pandemic, but subsequently environmental swabs were taken around the market. And in the very area of the market where animals were known to be housed, that are also known to be capable of being infected by the COVID virus, the swab showed that when you swab those areas, you could find evidence of those animals, and on those same swabs, you would find evidence of the virus that causes COVID. So that's another bit of evidence that strongly suggests that the virus first emerged there. Plus, another reason is that there were multiple spillover events, or there were multiple lineages early on in the emergence of the pandemic that makes sense from having come from a wildlife market rather than multiple accidents from the lab. But I want to be very clear. We don't know definitively the source of the pandemic. I'm just saying that there is more evidence to suggest that it came from a wildlife market than it does from the laboratory itself.
Okay, thank you. In the chat, there's a question about the connection between population, our exploding population, and I guess you would say with biodiversity.
Yeah. So, a few thoughts on this. Certainly, we have over 8 billion people on this planet, and that is obviously putting pressure on the planet. But I also want to be clear that a lot of the resource consumption is not coming from places where much of the population growth is happening or where there's a lot of population density. In fact, most of the resource consumption happens from high-income countries such as the United States or the United Kingdom, whereas the footprint of someone in China or India or Uganda is far less than someone in the United States. So we just have to be very careful about attributing our environmental catastrophes to rising populations. There's probably there are a number of reasons why actually many scientists are saying that we have enough resources on this planet for all 8 billion of us to live very good lifestyles. We just have this inequity in the distribution of the resources. And so, that's a whole different conversation. There's a very good book that I recently read that's called Not the End of the World by Hannah Ritchie, where she explores a lot of different environmental catastrophes and how actually with modern technology, we have the ability in many instances to overcome the challenge. A lot of the issue is political will. There are many entrenched interests that prevent us from taking the right action. You know, when you look at climate change and investments in renewable energy, or when you look at a number of other issues. Now, there's a follow-up question from Catherine about deforestation. So I want to give an example. You know, I as a medical doctor, I didn't understand this until I joined Conservation International around 4.5 years ago. But there are ways to stop deforestation. And again, this is a question of political will. If you go back to the early 2000s, the Brazilian government decided that it would invest in an integrated policy approach to address deforestation in the Amazon. So they started returning territories to indigenous peoples who are known to manage the land better than other groups of people. They started, there was a moratorium on sale of illegally harvested beef from the Amazonian region, and a number of other measures were implemented. As a result of that integrated policy, there was a 70% reduction in rates of deforestation in the Amazon. But at the same time, agricultural productivity increased in the Amazon. So all too often we put deforestation up against agricultural output, and it doesn't have to be that way. We have ways to better manage our relationship with the land than we currently employ right now, and we need to be implementing those solutions. I'll just say one last thing, and I know there are other questions in the chat that we can get to, but if you want to hear more about what I just mentioned and just my perspective on spillover prevention, I did a TED Talk a few years ago that I just dropped in the chat. And also on my website, I have a number of bits of writing that I've done that you all can also browse if you're interested in learning more.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the work of Conservation International? And then you're also being asked about bat conservation international. But I think, the work of conservation, I mean, you sort of touched on it a little bit, I think, but you want to explain just a little bit more.
Yeah. So I'm living my live stream. I wanted to break into the conservation sector, and it happened 4.5 years ago. With unfortunately, the COVID pandemic brought a lot of awareness on this intersection between human health and environmental health and the health of animals. And that's what created this opportunity. And so when I joined Conservation International 4.5 years ago, a lot of my work was focused on policy advocacy. So I was working with people in the Convention on Biological Diversity and the World Health Organization and elsewhere to implement global policies to better protect the planet for the benefit of humanity. And I'm really excited to say that advocacy by myself and by many other people actually had an impact. Like I said before, we had the pandemic agreement outcome earlier this year. If you look at the Convention on Biological Diversity, there was a lot of great movement in the last back in 2022 and 2024 around that. So there are good things happening. And we hear so many negative stories all the time, but there's actually so much action. And I've never been more hopeful for the world because I'm surrounded by people that are doing amazing things every day. Now, at this point in time, a lot of my work for Conservation International is more focused on research and public communication. On the research side, it's around quantifying the human health benefits of our work to protect forests in Palawan in the Philippines, or to we have this management model of the land of rangelands in Africa, particularly grasslands in Africa. And so trying to measure how do people benefit as they are managing lands more holistically. Or another example is in Guyana. We're looking at the amazing work that our team in Guyana is doing around protecting the Amazon forest, but how are people benefiting directly with regards to the health from that work. Now, there's also a question about Bat Conservation International. That is another amazing organization. I have had a number of conversations with them. They do great work. I have a bat box that I bought from Bat Conservation International as well. So, there's so many good organizations out there, right? The Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, many others. But it's a challenging time to be in conservation as well. So, this work, to keep it going, we do need the support of many people, people in the public, but also governments and philanthropies and all of that. So we appreciate the support that you all have provided.
So you're also being asked, what are some of the specific, there's a few more questions, and I know we're getting close on time. What are some of the specific ways to increase agricultural production while still maintaining the rainforest? I know you need to leave soon, so maybe make the answers short because you have a few
Yep.
more questions.
Well, my answer to this one will certainly be short. Marilyn, unfortunately, I am not an expert in agriculture, but a lot of it has to do with how we manage the soil. Soil health is a totally neglected issue, but at the end of the day, if we don't have healthy soil, you can't grow all of these plants that feed people and animals and create ecosystems. And so a lot of this has to do with our mismanagement of soils and how do you rotate crops through it and maintain the vitality of soil.
Can you talk to us briefly about bird flu, which I think is some of the problems are a little different?
Yeah, bird flu is one of the most concerning issues out there. The emergence of this virus can be traced back like almost 30 years ago in the late 90s basically in China on these farms where poultry were being raised. And there probably was basically the movement of a wild bird influenza virus into these domestic poultry. And from there, in crowded conditions, in unsafe conditions, when you have a lot of genetic homogeneity in farmed animals, basically creates the conditions for the virus to propagate and spread. And it basically spread across the world. Also moved over with wild birds. But here in the United States now, last year, we saw the emergence of avian flu. It spilled over into dairy cattle, and there's just not been enough transparency around the situation on U.S. farms. But again, the way we raise farm animals is not good for our health ultimately when you think about the pandemic risk, but it's also inhumane, right? But whereas if we treated these animals better, it would be win-win for people and for the planet and for the animals themselves. So we need to be doing a better job. Avian flu is one of the things that really keeps me up at night. It's quieted down right now, but we expect that, generally speaking, in summer months, and I hope it does not come roaring back this winter. It really does concern me.
You're being asked about factory farming and the bird flu.
Yeah, again, factory farming. If you look at the lineage of our cattle in the United States, I mean, there's just not a lot of genetic diversity in that cattle. Same thing goes for chickens, right? And so when you stick all of the same type of animal in these really awful conditions, it's basically dynamite waiting to be lit. And as soon as a virus gets introduced into those populations, it can spread like wildfire because of that crowding and the genetic homogeneity. And so factory farming, the way we raise these animals, does contribute to the risk of bird flu. That is a fact.
And have metrics been developed that clearly illustrate the direct relationship between factory farming and the risk of pandemics?
These metrics are really challenging when you're dealing with pandemic prevention. And, if you take the factory farming situation, again, there's not a lot of transparency. So it's hard to get in the United States where we asked of other countries that they share data on viruses emerging within their borders. We ourselves, quite frankly, weren't doing that great a job last year, including under the Biden administration, in releasing that data. And part of the reason for that is that the agricultural sector has a lot of power in the quarters of where these decisions are being made in Washington, D.C. And so it was hard to get that transparency. There's a very strong lobby against locking down and not sharing information. And there are, if you look at the deforestation side, the people out there doing the work on the ground face life-threatening situations, right? It is a very dangerous job to be an environmental activist in places like the Amazon, or when you're trying to protect wildlife from poaching, right? People die, they get killed, they get murdered, assassinated. So it's really hard to get good data, but things are changing with artificial intelligence, with satellite data. At least on the deforestation side, we can track forest cover a lot better, right? So I do hope that there might be ways that we can overcome some of these challenges.
Well, I want to let you leave because I know you need to leave. You need to start out for someplace else. But there's something in the chat. Thank you. This has been outstanding. I'm tuning in from Arkansas. So I want to agree with that chat. It really has been outstanding. It's so informative. I know I'm going to definitely want to watch this again, and this will be available. We will be posting it on the website. Thank you so much for joining us. This was excellent.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Please stay safe, stay healthy,
Okay.
and wishing you all the best.
Okay. Thank you so much.
All right, goodbye.
So you should all be able to unmute yourselves if you want to, if there's any responses or thoughts on that before we move on to the next topic. I thought it was really excellent and informative. And, the question is, what can we do ourselves as activists to address this problem? So I don't know if people have thoughts on it. I mean, I guess I have a few, but I'd rather hear from you all. Anyone, you should be able to unmute yourselves. George, you sure they're able to unmute?
They should be. So for example, Roseanne Klein, can you unmute yourself? Or maybe I should have picked someone who's on video. Deborah Kerr, can you unmute yourself?
Or
Yes.
Susanna?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah,
people can
okay,
unmute themselves.
okay. I mean, one of the difficult things about biodiversity and extinctions is, it's a big problem, and there are multi factors on it. As he mentioned, yes, there's deforestation seem to be one of the leading ones, overexploitation of resources, climate change, loss of habitat, all of these things. One of the things I feel very strongly about is that we need to educate the public about it, which is why we've been doing this series, because I think there's just no awareness of it. Certainly we need to be making our communities more aware of the need to preserve habitat. The problem with habitat is that it's lost patch by patch. Obviously, climate change, I think most of us are already working to address that. Any other thoughts on what we could be doing, should be doing to um, raise awareness or, make kind of address it on the local level or state level? Forget about federal right now. Any other thoughts?
Well, I think the big thing is that I don't know exactly how to have that happen, but that we know kind of what's going on with the government so that the lands that we do have that are preserved, habitats don't get changed. Like and I'm only minorly informed on this. I do find it a little bit complicated, but I heard about this data center that's being built in Northern California, Northern New York, and they're going to take up all this land.
Mm. There's data centers, being proposed or being built all over. It's
And
unfortunate.
warehouses
Yeah,
Oh,
warehouse.
yes, right,
Another one.
warehouses.
and roads.
Yes.
Yeah.
But one of the things about, the warehouses are a new threat, an emerging threat, to use that phrase, but also the data centers are very energy intensive, and
Yeah.
that's the problem with them.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
the
mean,
complexity of that too, like where's that energy going to come from?
and sometimes
And
water, sometimes
and
water.
then the water that it needs,
Mhm.
but also the amount of land that it's taking up and who it's taking it from,
Mhm.
and that unless you live right there, you don't know that it's
Mhm.
happening.
Mhm. Right, right. We need to maybe pass legislation, and I would say at the state level, because we think we can all. I mean, I see the posts about the federal level. Yeah, we all are very aware of what's going on. The environmental catastrophe of the federal policy right now. So our best shot is at the state and local level right now. I try to focus our energy where it can make a difference and hope that some of the others, we can keep things moving ahead. Um, okay, I see Gary's post. I love Neil's presentation. It was thorough and relatively easy to understand. The problem is I still feel overwhelmed by the 8 billion people on the planet with no sign of slowing down. Um, and the human aversion to take the advice. Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking when he was talking was that one of the problems with the emphasis on preparedness for the next one versus prevention is that there's something called the tragedy of the commons. If I have to try to sum it up, I would say it's that people, when a community spends money to be better prepared, that affects that community very directly. So you know that you're benefiting yourselves. But when you do something to benefit, to prevent, it tends to be something that you're doing the right thing, but it doesn't have as direct an impact. Let's say you preserve habitat. That doesn't mean you're not going to have another pandemic. You're doing the right thing, but we need everybody or many people to be doing it. And that's another problem in addition to the short-termism. Okay, just
Yeah, I think the point that he made about prevention of pandemics is very well taken. I mean, what we could have put into preventing COVID was just a small fraction of what it actually cost every government in the world to deal with COVID.
and climate change. Some of the things that we're talking about have multiple impacts.
Mm,
Climate, we're already seeing, I don't know, trillions of dollars in costs, and
mhm.
in addition to just the human impacts, which will be catastrophic. There's a question in the chat. Are you aware of efforts in our area toward veganism? One of the biggest things we can do as individuals is to eat less meat and to eat fewer animal products. I wish I had it really handy. I have a wonderful graph about if you Google carbon impact food, you'll probably find graphs online, and it's just so dramatic. The difference between, all the meat is all the way huge impact, and the plant-based products like beans and vegetables and grains are at the low end, and it's just very vivid. So, to promote veganism, maybe we should do a program on that sometime. I don't know. What do people think? Okay, getting the message into the main media, because often we are educating the already aware. Yeah, but how do we do that? Okay, consider limiting family size and be very conscious of consumption. Yeah, and particularly lowering our meat consumption. Okay. There's an excellent book by David Quanman on this topic called Spillover that might be interesting. I plan to reread. It does sound interesting. I've heard about it before. Okay. To get political action is so important and difficult. Would scaring people help? That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say, wake up, everyone. I know we move on to the next topic, but I felt it was important after such a powerful presentation to sort of process it a little bit together. I am really trying to, read people the Riot Act, what's going on with the loss of biodiversity and extinctions is really, to use my son's word about climate change, it's terrifying. You can't unravel the web of life and then think that it's not going to impact human beings. It has to. He said 500,000 in the next decades. I think I've read 1 million. I know I've read 1 million by the end of this century. And everything is interconnected. So, when it's like a huge science experiment. I just want to mention again, November, I think it's 20th, it's the third Monday of the month. We'll be having a presentation on loss of biodiversity and fungal networks. These are the fungal networks underneath the ground that sustain plant life. And everything depends on everything is dependent on plant life. The animal life, wildlife, and human beings are dependent on plant life. So essentially it's, if the fungal networks are in symbiosis with 80 to 90% of plant life. That's a lot. So it's going to be a talk about the fungal networks beneath our feet that I think many of us know very little about. So, okay, Linda is posting in, scaring means, do you know how horrid it is to die from, or what an animal raised for food goes through? I think we should do a program on animal factory farming. That's for sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm seeing some approval of that idea. Okay. So we have another topic, which is Steve Redler will be speaking from Sierra Club. Co-chair of the political committee will be speaking about election machines that are under consideration in some communities, including Rockland County. So, Steve, do you want to talk about this? I mean, this really could be possibly relevant to others on this call who are not from Lower Hudson Group, but we know it's being considered for purchase by Rockland County Board of Elections. Steve?
Okay, well, thank you, Peggy. I'm not sure I can do much better than Neil on that. That was a fabulous presentation. He's excellent. But I'm going to talk a little bit about our system of voting that we have in New York State and a good portion of the country as well. And the proposals there are to change our system of voting, with the machines that we vote on. I think most people are familiar with the New York State system of how we vote, which is we fill out a paper ballot, and then what happens is we feed it into the machine, and after that, the scanner reads what boxes we checked or X'd, and then it records our vote, and it drops a piece of paper that we filled out. The scanner machine drops a piece of paper we fill out into a box at the bottom of the machine, and there's an actual recorded, system of being able to audit how people voted. And if we, fill out two boxes for the same election race, then the machine rejects it. There's various safeguards for people overvoting, and if you undervote, it also gives you a message saying you're undervoted or something like that, Bill. So there are, some safeguards to that system. However, there is a move to change the system of voting. And what I would like to do, can I share the screen, Peggy? Do I have?
Yeah, let me just make you a co-host.
Okay.
Okay.
I have a document. I'm just gonna put up some bullet points there.
Okay. You should be able to.
Okay.
You should be able to.
Okay. Can people see this?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Maybe I
You
have
have
to
to
click
share your
share.
screen at the bottom.
Okay. Maybe I did it too early. Hold on one second. Okay. There we go. Okay. Okay. And how about now?
Nope, not yet.
Let's see. Hold on a second.
You want to just skip it and talk it to
Yeah,
us?
I'll probably just
Okay.
skip it.
Okay.
Um, so I just described, how our voting system works right now, but there's a lot of companies all over the country that want to make money on the different types of voting, and they all want to use touch screens instead of pieces of paper. So what happens is that they're proposing to various state boards of elections or county boards of elections in New York State to use a different kind of machine. And this one of the companies is called ES&S, and their machine is called Express Vote XL. And ES&S is marketing their latest touchscreen machine to various counties across the state, including Rockland County. And the way the machine works is, hold on a second, let me see if I can share. Okay. No. Let me see if I can get this up. Okay, now, yes. Okay.
Nope.
So
Okay.
now
Yes.
you
Yes,
can
I
see
see it.
that. And
Mhm.
so the way the machine works, can people see that now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good. So the way the machine works is that it's a touch screen, like a lot of people are familiar with, and they touch the boxes where they want to vote, um, and um, and then what happens is the machine translates those votes into what is called barcodes, and the barcodes will look like this on a machine, and it says and this is an example in Philadelphia County, um, and it shows what they selected in words, but and there's also above that is a barcode. And so what happens is the machine will read the barcode and then takes that piece of paper that's attached inside the machine. The voter doesn't get to take that home with them or anything, and it drops them into the machine. And here's a bigger picture of the barcode, and it tabulates the vote based on the barcode, um, and it drops it into the machine, and at the bottom, and that's the system. And what's wrong with that system is it eliminates the hand-marked paper ballots that most counties use. There's no way to really audit that voting system. So what happens is, and it tabulates the barcode, and you know, there have been situations in various counties, especially in Pennsylvania, where the barcode didn't correspond to the actual vote, and they audited it after the election was done, and it didn't correspond to the actual vote. How often does that happen? I don't know, but if it happens once, it's one time too many. And so there's really no way to check on how the people voted. Um, and that is the problem with that. The state election law states that a voter must be able to privately and independently verify the votes selected and correct any error. And this machine doesn't allow that. Um, and so without being able to read the barcodes, a voter can't in fact verify their vote, because there's no way, for example, in this thing, if you voted for one of those people, you can't know if the barcode actually corresponds to the names on the ballot that your selection indicated. Um, and our concern is that the New York State counties that use this equipment will decide to replace their ballot scanners with the Express Vote XL machines. And so the other thing to comment on is that the machines that we currently use, we have, all the voting systems have a booth that a voter can fill out the ballot and linger over their ballot selection. And generally, you walk into a voting place and there's like maybe 10 of those booths, and you take your time filling out the ballot, and then you go over to the scanner and you feed it into the scanner. So there's only one scanner, but that's the quick part of it. The slow part of it is actually making your selection of who you want to vote for. However, with this system, there is no scanner. That's all these voting machines, and each voting machine costs about $12,000, and they would each county would have to buy hundreds of these voting machines. It would probably be very expensive. probably several $1 million in the county, which is a part of the reason why some of the counties don't want this machine. But, still the ES&S is lobbying very heavily to purchase these machines. And there is some cost for the counties for using our current system with the paper ballots because the paper does get expensive. It's because it has to be printed and all that, but it's still much cheaper than buying hundreds. Each county would buy 500 machines or something like that. And we feel it's really necessary for Rockland County Board of Elections. When it becomes necessary for the Rockland County Board of Elections to replace its ballot scanners, it should keep the paper ballots and just upgrade the scanners instead, because paper ballots are more reliable. There's a couple other things to mention in this. Common Cause has a lawsuit against the ES&S voting machine. So it's possible they could win the lawsuit and the voting machines will be illegal. There's also state legislation called the VIVA Act that the Assembly was holding up, but it's possible that could be enacted in this coming legislative session. And the last thing is to mention, which is really scary, is that Trump has an executive order out on elections, and the executive order basically says that the establishing guidelines providing that voting systems should not use a ballot in which a vote is contained within a barcode or a quick response code in the voting counting. So Trump is actually opposing the ES&S machines as well. Trump is, in an odd way, is on our side on this issue at least. But the danger is that some of the counties or states will use this machine, and then Trump will try to invalidate the election for whatever race that is, Congress or something like that, because they violated his executive order.
So Steve, we want to try to wrap up because we're
Right.
trying to keep the meetings limited.
Right.
Maybe stop sharing and we can
Okay.
we'll go for a few questions. I know I have one or two. So maybe stop sharing. So
Okay. Got it.
So my question would be, okay, two things. First of all, what action are you asking people to take?
Right.
And then my first question, I guess before that, would be the votes can be counted, right? Because you can afterwards from they could take those slips and count them and see whether they conform with whether they align with the electronic count, right? I'm just trying to play devil's advocate.
Yeah, that's correct. They can count
They'll be
the
counted.
names on the sheet. Yes, they can count the names on the sheet, but that's not the way they audit the elections. They audit it using the barcode. Um, and
I see.
So what we're asking the Board of Elections to do is to contact the Rockland County Board of Elections and ask them not to use that machine, the ES&S Express Vote XL. There's a email, voter.info@co.rockland.ny.us, and you can send a message to the Rockland County Board of Elections, or you can contact the chair of the county legislature, which is J.A.Y. Hood, Hood, and he's chair of the legislature, makes the decision about what elections come out. And his email is Hood, Hood, just the letter J, @co.rockland.ny.us.
And can you repeat the name of the machines?
Yes, it's the
ESS?
ES&S Express Vote XL. And that's the name of the machine. I think there's some questions, but you have better view of that than I do on
Okay, I would not support any voting machine unless we'd be able to do an audit with the actual votes marked on paper. I agree. Okay, not to mention all the natural resources that are required to create the higher tech voting machines. Yeah, like why do we need to replace what we already have to throw
Mhm.
all of that out? I always think that about everything. I don't know why we had to replace the original ones, which seemed pretty good to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Well, that's
Any other questions if people want to raise their hand
mm.
or put it in the chat? So,
So I'm estimating that there might be like 1,000 voting machines in Rockland County. For example, Albany has like 500 voting machines, and Rockland is a bigger county than Albany by 3 times.
well,
So
okay.
that would be
And
like
what is
$12
okay?
million.
Last question, and then maybe we should wrap up. Is what is the status of this? When will this decision be made?
Well, that's up to each county,
How about for
what
Rockland?
they want to do. Erie and Monroe counties are a little bit ahead of Rockland County in terms of accepting the machines. They haven't actually purchased them yet, but they're strongly considering purchasing them.
Okay.
Rockland County does have one of the machines already in their office. That's for disabled people who want to vote. So they can use that. And the machines, the scanners they use are ES&S scanners. So the company already has a foot in the door because they're already working with that company for their existing equipment. So,
Okay. Okay. So again, ES&S Express, Excel machines that use barcodes. Those are the ones that.
right, right.
Okay. All right. Any other last questions, comments, anything? Okay.
Um,
Thank you so much, Steve.
okay, thank you.
That was very helpful.
Yeah.
And I know there are some people from Rockland County, so please make sure you call the Board of Elections or email Jay Hood. And guess if I want to wrap up to let people go.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much, everybody,
Thanks.
for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Very informative.
Okay. Yes, I thought so too.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Okay.
everybody. Good night. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.